So in this video, we're going to go over Chapter 2, different types of physical evidence. So overview, in this video, we will talk about the different types of physical evidence, the importance of physical evidence, how physical evidence is used in court, the cards exchange principle. Why do we examine physical evidence? Two purposes. One is to identification, determine the physical or chemical identity of a substance with as much certainty as possible. So the identity of a white powder, let's say. Comparison, subjecting both the evidence, which is the question sample, to the reference material or known sample, to the same test to prove whether they share a common origin. So you test DNA against you test the DNA found at a crime scene against a suspect to compare them. So aspects that differentiate an object from all other applications of science is also when you do comparisons, that's what you're trying to do, is to compare two things so that you know that the thing you're comparing to a question sample is most likely or with high probability unique to that person that they're comparing it to. So, example, blood stain on jeans of a homicide victim. If the stain came from the victim, the blood stain came from the victim, this piece of evidence is not as important because we already know the victim was present at the crime scene, so this stain cannot be used to identify the perpetrator. But it could be useful to provide clues about the way the victim was assaulted. We'll go over blood spray patterns later. But again, this blood stain on the jeans is not, if it's from the victim, you cannot be used to identify it. If it's not from the victim and it's from the perpetrator, then you can compare the DNA in that blood sample to DNA of a suspect. So types of evidence, physical evidence, tangible objects, objects that are real and not circumstantial, trace evidence found at crime scenes, like DNA, latent fingerprints, property recovered after the crime has been committed, so fingerprints, tire tracks, shoe prints, handwriting, and then a weapon used to commit crime. These are all types of physical evidence. There's so many types of physical evidence. These are just a few. So types of physical evidence. Transient evidence, which is temporary. It's easily changed or lost, and it's usually observed by the first officer on the scene because it's easily lost or changed, like the odor, temperature, imprints, indentations. If there are tire imprints on the ground or shoe prints that aren't very deep and it starts to rain and the mud becomes muddy and you lose the imprint, that might be a transient evidence. Or if there is a footprint in snow and the snow melts, then it was temporary transient evidence. Pattern evidence, it is produced by direct contact between a person and an object or between two objects. So blood spatter would be an object meeting a person, a knife, an object, which is the knife, hitting a person, causing blood spatter. Glass fracture pattern, let's say someone's knuckle hits or fist hits the window and it has a fracture pattern. A fire burn pattern which would be based off of where the fire was in the property or area where there is a fire burn. Projectile trajectory, so like bullet mark or bullets, they are two objects, a bullet hitting a wall, or you can have a bullet hitting a person too. Tire marks, which is between a person or an object and another object, the earth, like the ground and the tire. and modus operandi, which is the method of operation, can include, usually includes an object and a person. Conditional evidence is produced by a specific event or action. It's important in crime scene reconstruction and in determining the set of circumstances or the sequence within a particular event. So if there's light on, off, what kind of lighting, there's smoke, the location of all the evidence and crime scene, vehicles that were there when you got there, the victim's body, fire, if there was fire, what kind of fire, what did the fire look like. Transfer evidence is produced by contact between people and objects or between people and people, like DNA, so saliva from one person to the other person. Fingerprints, you touch someone and now your fingerprint is on them. Fibers, if you hug someone, then your fibers could get onto, your fibers of your sweater could go onto the person's shirt fibers. Associative evidence is something that helps you associate a victim or suspect with the scene or other individuals. So it can link evidence to individuals involved in a crime. So it links evidence between the suspect and a crime scene to prove that the suspect was at the crime scene, or between personal belongings. So here's a graphic of all of that. Some people like seeing graphs better than just a slide full of text. So it says everything that we went over before, and it's in the notes if you'd rather look at this page than the previous page. Types of physical evidence, common types of physical evidence. There are a lot of common types of physical evidence, which means there's even more less common types of physical evidence. Physical evidence can be anything that is deemed valuable to the investigation. So drugs, any drugs, prescription, illicit drugs, blood, semen, and saliva, either dried or liquid. They're useful in identifying unknown people or establishing connections between objects and people by analyzing the DNA in them. Fibers, synthetic or natural fibers, and they can establish connections between objects or persons. Like I said before, hug someone with your sweater on, you get fibers on there. The other person, if you sit down with your sweater on, the fibers from your sweater can be transferred to the chair. Fingerprints, visible and latent. Firearms and ammunition, they look at shell casings and bullets. Glass, holes in glass, glass fragments, cracks, how glass fractures, the glass fracture pattern. Hair, any human or animal hair. Impressions, shoe prints, tire tracks, palm prints, bite marks, things like that. Organs or body fluids, they usually undergo toxicological analysis to see if any drugs, alcohol, or poisons were in the body at the time of the murder, and if so, how much. Explosives, objects containing explosive chemicals or objects covered with residue from an explosion. Paint, dried or liquid. Petroleum products, grease, oil stains, gasoline, paint thinner, kerosene. If there was gasoline at a fire site, they would, if it's recoverable, they would look for it. Plastic bags, common household garbage bags. So I once watched an episode of Forensic Files years and years ago, and it somehow stuck with me. But they used a garbage bag in the crime for something. I can't remember what was in it, but they're able to trace that garbage bag back to the batch of bags that were made from the manufacturer and where those bags were distributed. So the bags were made from batch A from this manufacturer. They are distributed to this 2 store locations, and then they could look at people who bought garbage bags between the time where they arrived and when they got their next batch where they were all gone. And it also has to do with the striations in the garbage bags. There's a lot of stuff you can get from garbage bags, which I didn't know. Plastic, rubber, polymers, common plastics found in the home. Powder residue, part of this could be the discharge of firearms. Serial numbers, a firearm ID number, vehicle number, ID number, serial numbers of computers and electronic devices. Documents, handwriting samples, typewritten samples, printer or typewriter. People don't usually use typewriters anymore, except in murder shows. You see people typing on a typewriter. I don't know why. Maybe because they don't think there's a electronic link to them. Paper, ink, erasures, heat treatment. Any of these apply to documents. Soils and minerals. Soil, gravel, sand from various locations. You can test if the gravel, soil, or sand comes from one location or a different location, or if they match in the crime scene and that around the suspect's house, something like that. Tool marks, objects that can leave an impression, like crowbars, screwdrivers, hammers, and parts from vehicles, objects broken off from an automobile, a lot of times headlights. This is a graphic, again, of the categories of physical evidence that kind of goes over what we just talked about. Different main categories are biological, chemical, physical, and miscellaneous. So biological has body fluids, protein-containing evidence, and there's a lot of different types of it. Blood, semen, saliva, sweat, tears, hair, bone, tissues, urine, feces, animal material, insects, bacteria, fungi, and botanical materials, to name a few. Chemical, nothing alive, man-made materials. You want to determine the composition of the evidence. Remember, chemical is the analysis of nothing alive. Toxicology is the analysis of if a chemical is present in the body. So chemical analysis can include fibers, glass, soil, gunpowder, metals, minerals, narcotics, drugs, paper, ink, cosmetics, paints, lubricants, fertilizer. Physical, tangible pattern evidence, so like patterns and impressions. Could be fingerprints, footprints, shoe prints, handwriting, firearms, tire marks, tool marks, and typewriting. And miscellaneous ones would be, like, for example, voice analysis. They do voice analysis now, which is a little controversial. Polygraphs, which have been proven to, you could fake a polygraph. Stress evaluation, or vehicle ID number. So physical evidence in court. Physical evidence only has value in court when the forensic scientist who testifies about that physical evidence can explain to the jury how that evidence was analyzed and how the results of the analysis or the analytical test can be interpreted in the context of the crime. So if you have evidence of cocaine on a victim's body, or you have evidence of cyanide in a victim's body through toxicology, the forensic scientist who testifies has to be able to explain to the jury how cyanide looks like in the body, what it means when you find cyanide in the body, the concentrations of the cyanide can be used to interpret the context of the crime, things like that. So there are 4 different cases. The first one was Fry versus United States in 1923. What came out of it was the Fry standard, which were the guidelines for determining the admissibility of scientific evidence. It was debated that it had the inability to deal with new scientific tests as technology got better, so a different standard was put forth. Coppolino and State in 1968. In this case, there was a medical examiner that testified that the victim died of a prescription drug overdose, because the medical examiner found a high concentration of a compound that the drug breaks down into, and relied on these results in determining the cause of death. So when you take a drug or medicine or anything in your body, it starts to be metabolized, so it breaks down into smaller, different components. And the medical examiner found one of those components that's known to be breakdown product of a specific prescription drug. And based on the results of that high concentration, they said that the cause of death was an overdose of this drug. The defense argued that the toxicological data gathered in this new test wasn't widely accepted by the scientific community yet, so it shouldn't be admissible. But the court ruled in favor of the prosecution and noted that scientific progress is inevitable. New tests are constantly evolving. So this led to the Coppolino, I have no idea if I'm saying that right, standard, which is that the court can admit a new test or a controversial scientific theory if there is adequate foundation for proving validity, even when the scientific community as a whole is not familiar with it. So if you have a new test that is new, if it has a test that is newly developed and been found to be valid through different tests, different laboratories doing the same test to make sure they come up with the same result, their results being published, then it can be considered to be admissible. Then in this case, in 1993, the Daubert standard, I don't know if I'm saying that right again, which is a test applied still today in federal courts to determine the admissibility of scientific evidence. It's a strict test, and it requires that the trial judge rules on the admissibility of the evidence. They are the one that says if it's admissible or not, and they are the only ones. They use guidelines to help them gauge the validity of the scientific evidence. First one, has it been tested before, the scientific technique? DNA analysis, PCR, that's been tested many, many times, shown that it's true and valid. So evidence from DNA analysis evidence using PCR method would be admissible. Has the technique or theory been subject to peer review and publication? Usually to have a SOP, a standard operation procedure, which says how you do a test or analysis, is based on the test results and research that has been done on a certain technique or theory. The results from this technique or theory, this new one, needs to be subject to peer reviewed, so other forensic science experts look at this data and try to replicate it, and if they can replicate it, then they think it's valid as well. And then you publicize the results, and other researchers can do the same technique as well to make sure it's valid. And then after a period of time, then it can be considered concrete and used frequently. What's the technique's potential rate of error? Every technique and analysis has a possible rate of error or testing error. A lot of it is insignificant statistically insignificant rate of error or statistical error. If it's high, then it's less likely for the new technique to be considered, because it will be defended against by the defense attorney what the rate of error is. If it's too high, then people aren't going to believe that results from it are adequate. Do standards exist that can verify the technique's result? This is kind of like what I said before. The standard operating procedures are due to quality control, or based off of are a result of quality control and quality analysis and performance tests of the techniques, make sure that the test is proper and it's working well, and that the worker in lab who are working on it are performing it properly. They always have standards run when they do an analysis, that you know what the results should be. So if those come back and the results aren't what they're supposed to be, then that batch of analysis probably isn't correct and you would need to redo it because there was obviously error somewhere. And then, has the technique or theory gained widespread acceptance within the scientific community? The previous case we talked about said that there's again, this is at the discretion of the judge, if they believe that this technique or theory is good enough or proven enough, even if it's not widely accepted in the scientific community yet. Then this last case, tire company, 1999. So the Dober standard was considered pretty strict, too strict, when it was first proposed, but in this case, it was reaffirmed and ruled that the trial judge should be the gatekeeper for expert testimony and scientific evidence. It upheld that the trial judge is the one who decides if it's admissible or not admissible, or if expert testimony should be allowed or not. It's all goes through the judge. So, Edmund Lockhardt's exchange principle. This is huge in physical evidence. It says any action of an individual, and obviously the violent action constituting a crime, cannot occur without leaving a trace, otherwise known as every contact leaves a trace. Every time you come in contact with someone, you have now exchanged physical evidence. With contact between two items, there will be an exchange of materials between them. The value of trace or contact forensic evidence was first recognized by Edmund Lockhart in 1910, and he was also the director of the first ever crime lab in the world, and it was in France. So, using Lockhart's exchange principle, this is the You Are the Forensic Scientist spotlight in Chapter 2. It says, consider the following trace evidence, which was found at a murder crime scene. In the victim's room, where the murder occurred, there is a fabric-covered chair. The suspect's jacket and sweater are seized from his apartment and examined for fiber evidence. They find that the jacket and sweater, or the chair, has fibers that match the jacket and the sweater. And the jacket has fibers from the chair on it, but the sweater does not. So, looking at this information, we want to explain how the fibers might have been transferred between the jacket and sweater in the chair. And does this evidence prove that the suspect was in the victim's room more than once? So the first question, explain how the fibers might have been transferred. The evidence strongly supports the hypothesis that the suspect sat on the chair wearing his jacket because there are fibers on his jacket, chair fibers on his jacket, and jacket fibers on the chair, so it strongly suggests that the suspect sat on the chair wearing his jacket. Fabrics from the suspect's sweater were found on the chair, but no chair fibers were found on his sweater. This suggests that the fibers from the sweater were transferred to the chair by secondary transfer, which means that somehow the sweater fibers got on the jacket earlier, and when he sat down, the sweater fibers and the jacket fibers were transferred to the chair. But it doesn't mean that the sweater got the chair because it wasn't in direct contact with it. Secondary transfer, trace evidence transferred from one object to another by the way of an intermediate object. For example, the sweater fibers transferred to the chair by means of the jacket. And it's important that investigators consider the possibility of secondary transfer when they examine trace evidence so that they can look at all evidence properly. And then the second question, does this evidence prove that the suspect was in the victim's room more than once? No. The fiber evidence indicates that the suspect sat in the chair. It does not indicate how many times the suspect sat in the chair. It doesn't matter if there's a whole bunch of fibers on the chair or not. Evidence only shows what is there and what is not. It does not show how many times that person would have sat in the chair. So I hope in this video that you learned that the physical evidence is examined for two main reasons: for the identification and comparison purposes. Different types of physical evidence: the transient, which is temporary; pattern evidence, which is contact between object and person or object to object; conditional, conditions of a specific event, action, or crime scene; transfer, the contact between people or people and objects; associative, links a person to a place or each other. And there are lots of different examples of common physical pieces of evidence. We went over them, there's a lot of them. And then physical evidence can be categorized into chemical, biological, physical, and miscellaneous. Just because the physical evidence can be categorized in these four does not mean that there are only 4 divisions of forensic science in the lab. There are multiple divisions of forensic science, multiple forensic science divisions in labs per category. And the Locard's exchange principle that every contact leaves a trace. This is very important in trace evidence. And that there are 4 court cases that shaped how evidence is deemed admissible or not in court, and who is responsible for the judgment, which is the judge.